I'm Dennis Arinetti, and I'm a member of the Lunch and Learn committee, and we welcome you to Ollie's Lunch and Learn. Um, you're all muted, I think, hopefully. Um, but as Nancy just has said, feel free down in the bottom, you'll find a chat window to go ahead and type your questions, and the speakers will hold off responding to those so as not to interrupt their flow. And we'll do Q&A at the end around 1:10 or 1:15, and then we'll be over by 1:30. Um, as Nancy also said, the program is being recorded. She did the legal stuff. The important thing about that is you can find the copy of the link in Ollie Notes each Friday, and the Lunch and Learns and other classes are loaded onto the Ollie YouTube site um, a day or so after they're presented. And its Lunch and Learn piece of that is open not only to all Ollie members, but also to non-members. So use it as a recruiting tool, and your friends can be educated like you are by passing on the advice to, they can go to the Ollie Furman YouTube site and actually view this stuff. Okay, so we're going to talk about Seeking Abraham. And that's the title of Furman's effort of discovery, I would say, of its relationship to slavery. This part of Furman's history, if not forgotten, certainly was covered in dust. Perhaps it was felt by many better left unknown. However, Furman went ahead, and we have two speakers today. First, Professor Brendan Nivet, that you have known for 4 or 5 Lunch and Learns over our history. And he is in Furman's Communication Studies department. He went to Furman and as an undergrad, and yes, he graduated. And then he went to Northwestern University and stayed there for longer than he stayed at Furman, earning his master's and PhD. And then, like the magic boomerang, returned back to Furman to teach, and has been here for what, 10 years or something?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, okay. Importantly for today, Furman selected him to lead this effort of discovery and made him the chair and co-chair of the task force of slavery and justice at the university. Equally important today is our opportunity to have a Furman student, Asha Marie, as a co-presenter. So she'll be talking in at the appropriate times. Asha graduated from a high school that's closest to where we live, Wade Hampton High, and now is a junior and studying a self-design major, which isn't easy to do because you got to get it approved, in advocacy and justice. So Brandon, would you lead us off on this journey of discovery?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dennis, for that kind introduction. And yeah, I've been around these parts a long time, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to help spearhead this project, is because as you often see, if you're on any social media, it takes white people recognizing that racism is their problem and doing something about it, rather than waiting to see what Black activism will do. We should all take part in correcting the injustice of the past. So happy to be here, happy to be representing Furman, Northwestern, and a lot of other groups that I'm part of and excited about. This is an update. I think I've done, like Dennis said, I've done Seeking Abraham presentations before. I recognize a lot of your names. Hello, the Aidens from entrepreneurship and innovation hour and all that. See a lot of folks that I know and love from Ollie. So I'll just be updating you. So if I skip something that you think is important in terms of the original questions, like the historical questions that we discovered in doing the research, just put that in the Q&A and say, hey, I'm not sure about what the Furman's relationship is to slavery, or I need a little bit more historical understanding. I will mention it in passing, so you'll be reminded of some of that. But I did want to go quickly past the history and really talk about the updates and the broader conversation that has national and international ramifications for us. And that'll also set up Asha nicely, because she's been a terrific leader even before getting to Furman, and then at Furman. Dennis was reminding me, I don't even remember all the things that she's taken part of. And so when they were talking earlier about her taking part in a Seeking Abraham's themed spring break, that had completely, I had completely forgotten that. So, she's been a part of so many processes, conversations, and so forth. Her major is tightly focused around these kinds of issues. So in many ways, she's more the expert than I am. I'm a white guy trying to do better and trying to do my part. And she is actually doing this as her intellectual academic focus, and really embracing this conversation as her experiencing at her experience at Furman. So kudos to her. Okay, let me share screen and get started, and we'll go from there. So as Dennis said, the title of our report is Seeking Abraham. If you saw the first edition, it has been updated, but only barely. So you're not missing much if you haven't seen the updated edition. What we did was we included the trustees' approval. They had a very stately approval and recommendation for what they wanted to take on as trustees. So that's appended to the back. There's an example of the kind of student-led projects and classes that are happening at Furman based on Seeking Abraham. And then I've got a few introductory notes about really, really detailed things that needed fixing, like the conversion of $1861 into US dollars today. You can imagine that the great thing about being in a place like Furman is we all come from different disciplines. And so the feedback you get is really wide ranging. So some people are upset about the currency conversion rates, and some people are upset about the visuals not being as good as they could have been or whatever else. So I got lots of feedback, and we did make a few small improvements, but nothing substantive changed about the report, only details. So let me take you through the process, and then we'll talk about the updates. So first, you may remember that the very first step we took after a student wrote an op-ed in our newspaper criticizing our lack of attention and focus to the history of slavery in Furman's history, we took a poll at Furman and said, how do you consider this history? And you can see the spread here that not a lot of them knew about the history, so they were only slightly aware. The majority were slightly aware of the history of slavery in Furman's past. If you ask students specifically, what do you know, they would just say, well, it's Southern, so I assume there is some relationship to slavery, but that was basically it. In this next one, you'll see students responding to the question of how important do you think it is for Furman to Dennis's point about, should Furman proceed or should we keep it quiet? What's better for the health of campus? And I think that's actually a relevant question. We often think about, and students often thought about the brand being tarnished in some way, but I would put the emphasis more on for our minority students. How does it feel to go to a place where you know that the namesake is deeply tied to slavery? And as we increase that focus, how much do you feel less tied to the organization? And does it make you not proud to wear insignia or symbols? How do you manage that complicated relationship? Of course, most of the students had experience with that. They've gone, as Asha has, with going to Wade Hampton High School. This is not a new phenomenon, nor is it unique to Furman. So, but listening to those voices was incredibly important for us. Anyway, as you see here, we read this data to say 80% think it's either highly important or moderately important to deal with this. Only 20% thought it unnecessary, discomforting to the point of diminishing their educational experience at Furman. When we asked students specific questions about how they felt about it, they were worried about the brand of Furman. They thought the idea of going to a university that had a relationship with slavery was going to decrease admissions, decrease our reputational stakes, and so forth. they thought the greatest value was the moral or historical value of doing this work. We hit the ground running with inventorying campus. And those of you who've heard me talk before will know that I have spent a lot of time in Pocket Sites, which is this app that was created. And this is how we documented all of the sites on campus. So we went through our campus and took a look at where slavery's legacies exist today. And so we looked at, of course, Cherrydale, which was a plantation house. We looked at smaller moments. There were cotton fields where Furman once was. And so we can look at the irrigation canals dug in those early days behind the chapel. Someone mentioned behind the chapel earlier. Behind the chapel, you can see where those fields existed and had enslaved labor. I recently found out there was a lynching on Furman's campus that I was unaware of until recently. Not related to Furman. We moved here in 1950. A lot of history in this place and in this space. And so Furman students went about documenting that. And there's this great tool. It's a great COVID tool because you can go out and take this walking tour of campus with your mobile device and not have to have contact with anybody besides yourself and your cell phone. Make sure it's charged. But anyway, you can walk around campus and take this tour. It's on Pocket Sites. And if you just search Furman, you'll find it. Now, in terms of what we were dealing with, I always like to put this slide up, which depicts the wealth disparity between Black and white in America. And so when people say, why study slavery? It seems so removed. I often would answer with this slide, because if not for slavery, this would not be possible. The idea and the numbers here saying that for every white person's wealth in America, which is $110,000, that would be like the amount that you would transfer intergenerationally, right? So I expect, on average, my parents, being white, would typically, have $110,000 in the bank on average at their time of death, and then that would pass to me, and so forth and so on. And you see what that's like for African Americans in comparison. Barely enough to honestly cover a funeral cost, right? So you're talking about, if anything, your parents putting you in debt rather than giving you any kind of advantage in terms of being able to pay for college, pay off loans, and so forth. And so we have this perpetual system that has only been kept going with the legacies of slavery, whether we're talking about Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, and up to mass incarceration today. So we were spurred by the current conversations. This is not just a historian out in the wilderness doing this as their research project. I'm actually not a historian. Obviously, I'm in communication studies, so I'm more interested in memorials and symbols and how they impact our conversations. Specifically, I'm interested in these cycles of violence. And this is where Asha could probably do a better job than me, but let me try to guide you through this. We joined up with an organization called Coming to the Table. Felicia Furman, who's a descendant of Richard and James, Richard, our namesake, James, our first president. And she was the one really who turned me to this and said, hey, have you thought about talking to students in these ways about the fact that we are all caught up in these cycles of violence? We're caught up in cycles of aggression and cycles of victimhood. And we don't just stay in one cycle. It's possible for us to, move from one to the other. And so we might be perpetuating a cycle of violence and aggression one day, and we might be perpetuating a cycle of victimization the next. But anyway, I think this is tremendously helpful for thinking about slavery, because if you start at that big red circle at the top, you think about traumatic events and traumatic acts of violence and how they spur and re-trigger and re-traumatize further acts. And so even if slavery was, 160 years ago, we still have all of these traumas continuing in our system, from the emotional, thinking about rhetoric now and the sort of communication aspect, the emotional aspects, the arguments that were created back then that are still with us today, and the notions of character and what we value in people, what values we pass down intergenerationally. And if you think about those as a perpetual system, it's very easy for us to recreate the exact same mentalities, the exact same traumas that our ancestors did. And so when we make a flippant joke or speak without thinking thoroughly about what we're saying, we often fall back into those routines that are not conscious, that are not meant to be harmful, but are a fact of this continual cycle of violence and aggression. And I want to, I'm happy to, by the way, send these slides out later so that you can have a copy of this to really, really study, because I think it's great to look at for a while. But I'll just take you through on the aggression side. If you think of, you think about the notion of Richard Furman that I inherited at first, which was a kind pastor who wanted to lead the Baptists in the state and wanted to lead people to Christ. I mean, that was our histories. When Steve O'Neill wrote our history for the Seeking Abraham report, that is the dominant narrative of Richard Furman, that his number one goal is saving as many people as possible, saving their souls for the Lord. That luckily, sort of on the positive side of the historical record, included African Americans. So he says, African Americans have souls. They are people. We should treat them better. We should give them education. The goal is eventual emancipation of the enslaved. And so he had his Christian idea of enslavement was, it's okay, it's biblically justified, but it's on its way to ending, and we should be part of that process. However, in reaction to the Denmark-Vesey scandal, fabricated partially, yes, but the threat of a revolt in Charleston, he participated in the cycle of aggression. And then James C. Furman, on the entry point to the Civil War, the same thing. And so we see both of them enacting these aggressive rhetorics, us versus them. You see him quoted here as, the Negroes should know. So in that letter, for example, the Negroes should know that even if they are the majority in Charleston, they are such a minority in the United States that if they ever took up arms, they would immediately be massacred out of America, right? So really aggressive rhetoric coming from this pastor who, had gone into these matters with a larger mentality, a larger sight for the gradual emancipation of slavery, but when threatened, easily adopted the white supremacy of his time and lashed out in those ways. James C. Furman, the same thing. You see his lynching rhetoric, his African-American males are sexual deviants who will come for the white women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they both on the verge of terror, on the verge of war, they both flip into these mindsets of aggression, even as their reputation otherwise and throughout their lives had been kindly, sweet people. Now, again, we can question that all we want because they are enslavers, right? And so to what extent can you be a kind or good or gentle person if you own other people, right? Here's the model that organization uses for getting out of this cycle. So they say, we are stuck. This is where those circles you just saw were down here. We're stuck in these cycles of aggression and victimization, but there is a way to break out of those cycles. And the first step is to find a place of safety and support, to feel like you can change your mind and not face horrible backlash. And again, I think that's part of what, in the case of Richard and James, was at work, was that they felt like their friends and their churches would leave them behind if they said something other than white supremacist discourse. But today, in terms of what we can do, we can begin these processes. We're going to have a night of lament at the end of this month, a part of the mourning and grieving process for the ancestors of our Black students who were not known and who are not known to us and who have not been named, but whose labor made the old bell tower, made the old campus, built the wealth on which a school like Furman is built, and so forth. We go about renaming things on campus. We have two examples I'll show you in a minute. We memorialize, we reflect on the deeper root causes. We take risk, we talk about ways to be more tolerant, we forgive. We try to do transformative justice, and that includes scary words like reparation, right? And so we think about ways that the money in the Furman pot can be redistributed in such a way as to create conditions of equality for all students. So even if students are coming from a background where that wealth picture I showed is part of the equation, Furman is providing the resources to undo that systemic problem and to say, hey, you have a spot here at Furman, despite that wealth gap that we're looking at from a national perspective. So these are the updates. That's my presentation on Seeking Abraham. Here's the updates part. We are still in conversation about what to do about the Cherrydale house. Asha, you might mention at some point that all of us have interesting relationships to this house. Asha temporarily took employment there, and so we had conversations about the strangeness of this plantation house being sat on campus, on top of campus, looking over campus, and what that means, and how do you deal with a symbol like that of a plantation house on your campus? What is the correct and appropriate? I had alumni email me and say that we should knock it down, and I had other alumni email me and said that I was the enemy and that my goal was to knock it down. And of course, I don't have any such motives either way. My goal, I think, would be historical preservation and appropriately remembering the history I just described, and possibly also making it a place for that repair that we just talked about, that healing of the victimization and aggression that the past has given us, would be my ideas. But I'm not on all the committees, and we'll talk about that. Asha and I will talk about that in a minute. But we are part of a larger process, and so we are in no way in control of this thing that we helped create. It is a larger system than us, which is a good thing. Smaller updates. We celebrated Joseph Vaughn Day with a small commemoration the first time, a trustee-backed commemoration the second time, and you see here in the library, I don't know if you all have made it to the library. Furman's pretty closed off right now to the community, but if you have some reason to be on campus, you would see that this has been hung in the foyer of the entry point of the library. I think it's the first African-American person to be honored individually on campus. Certainly part of if we're recognizing scholars or groups of faculty, they have been honored in the past. But in terms of a place of, here's an individual worth remembering, this is the first instance. There's no statues, there's no portraits, there's no commemoration of any sort to African Americans except this one. So a huge step forward for Furman, one that was obviously way overdue, and the proclamation of Joseph Vaughn Day right there below him. Here's Clark Murphy Housing, the renaming plaque. That's up already on Lakeside Housing. So you can see where the former custodian of the Women's College, who was called Uncle Murphy. This is a complicated thing. It's a sense of white entitlement to call him a family member, but at the same time, it also shows their feeling towards all the work and the connection and the strength that he brought to the Greenville Women's College. I love his story because it completely deflates the Furman's rhetoric about how African-American men were violent, criminal, sexual beings. Here's this man living as the only man on the entire Greenville Women's College campus, going into women's rooms all times of the day and night to fix things, run and get medicine for them and all the rest. And so in their employment was this enslaved individual who was everything other than what the Furmans were calling Black men in their worst moments. Here's the Furman Hall plaque. So we've taken James C. off of the building. He's there in the context in the description, but we've taken him off of the formal name of the building. So this is now Furman Hall, dedicated to the Furman family and all members of the Furman larger community, rather than honoring James C., who's exceptionally racist, exceptionally lynching, fit-friendly rhetoric we found incredibly distasteful for a building which houses our humanities, especially, where we're teaching everything other than advocating lynching and violence in the name of white supremacy. So took that name off and put this plaque up. You may have seen the notices. Just yesterday, we got a new one about the construction beginning on the Joseph Vaughn Plaza. So the entire area outside the library is going to be stripped out, made ADA compliant, so Disabilities Act compliant, and also have this new statue of Joseph Vaughn commemorating his work. He was the one who desegregated Furman, and so we'll have his visage on our campus finally. And this will be the first statue of a non-white person on our campus. And lastly, I just thought I'd just point real quickly at some student projects and conversations. This afternoon, there's going to be a CLP on campus about memorials. I think Asha's a part of that too. Sorry, Asha, you're having to double dip with speaking and so forth, but we love you. We want you to be part of Furman forever, obviously. So she's going to be doing that at, I think, 4:00 today, talking about memorials. And so I think one of the things that has happened at Furman is this broader conversation about memorials and how we think about the past in light of the present. And this is obviously the downtown memorial. This I had my students in my master's class take on redesigning or reconceptualizing this park and the sculpture. You can see the really offensive part of it. The quote here: "The soldiers who wore the gray and died with Lee were in the right." So not only can we remember those lost individuals of the war, but their ideology, their pro-slavery fight was the right cause. It is so deeply flawed. This is one of the things that Dylan Roof, who committed the Charleston Nine, was galvanized by. He went to the Confederate Museum here in town. He went to this memorial. He believed this rhetoric of the South, the white supremacy was right, and therefore went to the church and committed the massacre. So, shaking the finger here at Greenville, how dare you have this on Main Street, right, in our downtown? So my students went about reconceptualizing it. You can see them doing things like temporarily projecting the names of shooting victims onto the sculpture. And then you can see them really redesigning the park. This is Hattie Duckett, who started the Phyllis Wheatley Center here in town, holding the light. So when it says that the far off light of the future will show that Lee and his men were right, here's Hattie Duckett holding the light of equality, which would be a big beam of light that would outshine that white supremacist discourse. So you see students not only engaging. I think one of the things that I've tried to do in this work is to not just engage the past, but to really have students feel like this is changing the future, right? And so that symbols are not just part of a legacy, but also part of our future. Asha, I'll turn it over to you now because I have spoken enough.
Well, thank you for introducing me. It's actually funny listening to you go through Seeking Abraham again, because I guess I haven't really realized how many intersections of my Furman career I've had with this. And so I guess the beginning of how I got here was that I started the petition to rename Wade Hampton High School because I found out of its Confederate namesake, and that namesake then makes it a protected Confederate monument. And so as a Black student, I was like, I think it's a little funny that I'm going to this school being told to be like this guy who wouldn't have even supported like my livelihood, my right to education, like all of this stuff. And so I did the petition, and I kind of fell into being interested in Confederate monuments, public and local history, what stories we tell about our communities, who we honor, and like what that says about us, what symbolism means. And so I actually met Brandon at a night where he was presenting about the task force before they were going to finish it up and present it to the trustees. And I remember like meeting him and being like, I really want to be on this task force. I want to be a part of this work. This is so interesting. And I think I had just gotten accepted to Furman. And so the joke between my friends was like, so you're going to a high school named after a racist slave owner, and then you're going to another school named after another racist slave owner. I was like, yes. But one of the things that made me feel better about my choice in coming to Furman, because like I had other school offers. I could have gone to Georgia. I could have gone to Massachusetts. Like I could have gone where I wanted to, basically. But one of the things that made me feel good about my decision to come to Furman was the task force, and knowing that Furman was at least trying to take, or at least there were people at Furman. It's so easy to just like vaguely say Furman, and we're not actually saying who we're talking about, and there are real people behind these things. So the people with the task force, people at Furman, were interested in being honest and transparent and doing something about actually reckoning with our history. Like that was really interesting to me, and it said something about the values of Furman. And so when I got to Furman, I knew I was going to be interested in getting involved in these kinds of things. And eventually the task force kind of wrapped up, and I didn't get to be a part of the actual work of it. But I was able to go on a study abroad, or not a study abroad, alternative spring break, where we learned about the task force and all these little movements that came out of the task force, like Joseph Von Day, and other opportunities for learning about the history of Furman. And so that's been really cool to, and like in my classes also, we've been learning about, like, we'll read the task force itself and actually think about this. And it's interesting because Furman students tend to be pretty moderate. They might be interested in these things, but they don't fully engage. But then when we're sitting in class and we're saying like, no, we need to engage, like this is a part of our values, like we need to actually talk about this. That's pretty cool. But I don't know where I was going with that. Anyway, I guess what is interesting about the task force to me now is just that it's something I learned when I was on study abroad, actually with Dr. Anabanet. We went to Rwanda to study transformative justice, which is something that also came out of the task force, a main idea. And it was really hard for me as a Black student going on that trip because I'd never been to Africa. I don't have like any roots back to my African heritage, except for my ancestry DNA results. And one of the things we learned about how they handled their genocide and reckoning with that was they made sure everybody was on the same page about history. They said, nobody's going to disagree. This is exactly what happened. We're going to be totally honest, totally truthful, like even to the point where like it's really gruesome and like uncomfortable. And so they put up memorials and that kind of thing. And they don't even allow free speech on those issues anymore. But I thought that was interesting. I said, in the US, it's interesting because we allow so much disagreement on history. And so I saw that happening at Furman. There are still people with the task force who like, there's a section of campus who still think that the force's recommendations are unnecessary. They think renaming the buildings are unnecessary. They don't see the point of contextualizing this history or even bringing it out front. But I think it's an important movement towards progress. And so things that I'm doing on campus as an admissions ambassador, we don't have anyone doing the specific tour route. You have to download that like app to be able to learn the history. But I make sure on every one of my tours, when we stop at Cherrydale, I say, I used to work here. I was one of 2 Black people. I literally sat in the kitchen washing glasses one day of a plantation, a Black woman, the only one at the time. And I say, this used to be a plantation. We're doing this work with the task force. And most of my tours are like all white students and families. They're of the upper echelon. And it's really awkward. But what I want to see coming out of this task force is that we are no longer hesitant with these conversations. And we're no longer like allowing the ickiness with these conversations, because there shouldn't be ickiness. We have to be transparent. We have to be honest if we ever want to like make this actually a part of our values and stick with it. And so now I'm on the ad hoc committee also for Black Life at Furman. And the task force now is not actually acting. There are some subcommittees that are working on things. So I'm a student representative for the Joseph Bond statue. And that's been pretty cool to see happen, because I got to help decide like who's going to build it, where's it going to go, what's it going to say, that kind of thing, and actually be a part of what local and public history looks like on our campus and how we're going to tell our own history. But one of the things I'm working on the ad hoc committee is advocating for the task force to be a continuous thing, because a lot has changed in the 2 years that the task force has happened. So like I thought it was a pretty radical thing, first off, that Furman was going to be honest and transparent about this history. But since then, in the past 2 years, I feel like we've gotten a little bit more aware, a little bit more progressive. We know that like just telling the truth is a start, but there's more to be done. And I think Furman as a campus is ready to do more, and the trustees have taken recommendations, and I think it's time for more recommendations, honestly. If we really want to commit ourselves to our diversity, equity, and inclusion points on the website and all that jazz, like we have to do more. And so I'm pushing for them to make it a university funded, university supported, ongoing thing with faculty, students, staff, alumni, that kind of thing. But yeah, and I guess to address just like how students see the task force, students who have read it, I think, support it, but there's still a lot of confusion, I guess, about what the task force is, because it has been kind of quiet, or maybe there has been some kind of miscommunication amongst students. A lot of students still they aren't empathetic, like they don't fully understand why this could be important to Black students, and also to white students to stand for this. But But yeah, and so I guess they are looking for direction, and us committing ourselves to the task force would give them some direction, because students seem to just like fall in line with what other students are saying. This summer, we had a Black at Furman account pop up, where Black student stories of discrimination, oppression, and just like bad things happening at Furman came up. And it was surprising because a lot of Black students weren't even saying what direction they wanted to move forward. They just wanted to share their stories. But then white students were the ones who were like, fire everybody, we gotta take down this and blah blah blah. And it's like, is that really what we want? Is that really the direction we need to take? And so anyway, I'm rambling now, but I just think it will be interesting to see what direction the task force takes now. And yeah, I've been excited to be a student, just very involved in these conversations. I never meant to be, but it's been fun. Questions?
Thanks, Asha. Yeah, I'll just add that she's right about the systemic structure of the task force. So, we were asked on a voluntary basis, and again, it was sort of a negotiation, right? It was me going to the administration and saying, "Hey, could we? There is a group, a national support group called Universities Studying Slavery. There were only at that time about 6 or 7 universities involved. We would be the first to really jump into it as a liberal arts school, as a school in Deep South, South Carolina, rather than in Virginia. We could be a real leader in this area." And they signed on to that, and they signed on to it as a voluntary ad hoc process. And we made the argument several times throughout that process that, as Asha said, it should be, how is this thing going to be implemented? What was going to happen to it once we had, made our report? And we spent, I encouraged, as a chair of the group, I encouraged us to go all in, and we spent hours and hours and hours writing that report and doing it quickly within a year's time to try to, I think one of the things that we were trying to do is not have our Black students feel like this was just another salve. It was not just another, like, Furman's thinking about something and maybe one day we'll do something. It was like, let's just go ahead and do this one with a lot of action, with a lot of real recommendations, real steps forward action to go forward. And so we did it quickly, and we did it boldly, and we took a lot of free energy, or, obviously salaried in our faculty cases, but otherwise voluntary energy of people. And so, I went to the administration and said, what's next? Where's the process? Trustees have done a fantastic job, but on the academic side, we just haven't pulled our act together very well. Meaning that there's a lot of things that we're currently, and Asha is part of some of these too, we're currently working on things like how we're going to change the curriculum, how we're going to educate students differently. And then that doesn't even get to things like, we have the Joseph Vaughn Scholarship, but are we doing really intentional things with admissions beyond the basics? We do the things that most schools do, like having tours that are more sensitive towards Black history and so forth. But what if as to Asha's point, what if every tour at Furman did something, like that? What would that take? How would we educate our ambassadors to represent that history? And so Furman, we're going slow on some of those. The symbolic things, the trustee recommended things, we went fast, and I'm really proud of the accomplishment. The other ones, I'm in the middle of the road. I'm hopeful that we'll get to them, but I'm also concerned that we haven't embraced them as fast.
And I think also a challenge of that is that a lot of the student members and even the alumni have moved on from this project. So like a lot of the students who originally worked on this project are graduated, the alumni are doing other things. And so I think the momentum is kind of hard to keep on campus when students and other people who are new to the community as well just don't really know much about this initiative, which is why I think it's like all the more important for this to be more supported by the university, like at the forefront of what we're doing. And I know we're having a lot of conversations about, well, like, how do we change the social culture of our campus to better support Black and Brown students? And my answer is always be more clear about our values and support the task force, the work of the task force, because if we stand by that, like, we're being very clear. It's similar to like with the monuments say what they mean. They say exactly what they're protecting, what they stand for. And if we stand by our values, like, the symbolism's clear. So yeah.
Asha?
Yes.
Yes. Um, I think if you look at milestones or things as change, I think there's been some tangible evidence you talked about that things are changing on campus. Um, I read someplace, well, I actually read an article that you wrote for the Furman newspaper. Um, and if you tell the story about that, as I understand it, you were contacted by the paper and asked to, gee, Asher, would you mind representing um, the a diverse understanding and viewpoint that's different from most Furman students? So, how did you feel about that? And would you tell the group about your first well-written opinion piece?
Thank you. That's really sweet. The piece that Dennis is talking about is actually about low-income students and how many of them face astronomical barriers to our education, even though we're all guaranteed this Furman advantage. And I talked about how just the cost of textbooks can be the difference between eating for that day or that week. And so the reason why I began writing that is I'm always interested in these kinds of topics, but the Furman newspaper reached out to me and asked me to be a diversity writer and write for the Diversity Matters column, which I think is fine. You know, they want to highlight, diverse voices, but I was kind of like, why? Why can't I just write with everything else? Like, why can't you put my piece under opinion or under arts and culture or some other place? Why does it, just because I'm like brown and a low income student and like LGBTQ and like all these other identities that are like minority at Furman, like why do I have to go under a specific diversity column? So I still feel icky about that. I haven't written another Paladin piece yet, but I'm thinking about it. I don't know. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. I feel icky about it, but also I think it's important to use the platform that's been given to me to also open the door for other students and continue to share the voices of invisible students at Furman. In my comm class, I'm working on a podcast about invisible students and students who navigate kind of the intersections of community at Furman who don't fit the narrative that we sell in admissions. So maybe you'll hear about that sometime soon too.
I think
I did.
the other interesting thing that I read about you was that you also have two minors,
I do.
and one of those minors, I guess, is in poverty, right?
Yes.
But the other minor is in this Greek word derivative. You know, Brandon loves the Greeks, of course, uh, but and I don't even know if I can pronounce it right. Could you pronounce it for me? Start.
African American diaspora cultures?
Yes, yes,
Yes.
the D word, and apparently it has a root in Greek. Is that right, Brandon?
It is, yeah. Diaspora is any group that's displaced. So in the ancient world, there were barbarians outside of Greece. That word is also Greek. And then there's diaspora. So it's Greeks who were displaced. But yeah, of course, we use that term now to respond to denote, for example, the Black diaspora. So people who are spread out globally. You know, I often catch myself, I'll say African American sometimes when I mean the Black diaspora. You know, if I see someone on TV from London and I'll say, oh, there's African American woman, and I'm like, no, woman from the Black diaspora, right? And so it's a larger global issue, and the focus. I actually, they're going to change that title, I think, which it's good because it's too long, but at the same time, I love the word diaspora, and so I hope Furman
I
keeps
thought you
using
would.
it to think about that question of displacement and the question of sort of what place do bodies belong and not belong, and how do we create a belonging space for bodies? You know, so how do we make a place here in the U.S. that's not seen as the diaspora displacement, but in fact the home of African Americans, and that slow process of doing that. I did have one question in the chat that I wanted to deal with. It was sent privately to me, so I'll just respond. The question was, what are these? Who are these people I refer to? So let me take you through them real quickly. One of the ones I asked about was Abraham. Abraham was the namesake of our project, who was unknown to campus except for one photograph, and the caption said Abraham, an ex-slave, pictured with Cherrydale House, and so with the plantation house that's on campus. And so we were interested in him as a metaphor for the larger set of individuals who worked for, labored on behalf of, sacrificed for Furman, but weren't recognized. And so Abraham became a symbolic name. We did find information on him. So Abraham Sims, he's buried in Brutontown, next to the community center there. We've gone, and Asha's gone with me to clean up the cemetery there and talk to locals about that cemetery. We learned about his family. The second individual named was Joseph Vaughn. Vaughn was from the local Southern Side community. He was our student who desegregated Furman in 1965. And is universally hailed as a great person. And you're going to see that sculpture come along with a lot of great quotations about what he meant to the Furman community. Just a really, really marvelous. What I love about Joseph Vaughn is he never gave up on his fight. So even though he was put into this white dominant atmosphere where he could have just tried to, the goal could have been, I want to fit in here. And he didn't. He left the Baptist church and became Baha'i while he was a student. He went to Orangeburg and formed a march in downtown Greenville about Black Lives Matter, basically, in his time because of the Orangeburg massacre, and saying police should not be able to shoot innocent Black men and women in college. And so, organized a protest. So he kept his values, and he kept challenging. He kept a relationship with Furman, challenging Furman to say, you can be better than this. I know it. I know I'm going to stick with you guys. And we're going to keep doing better. We're going to do philanthropy. We're going to do service. We're going to do protest to make the place better. I probably explained Clark Murphy well enough. Murphy was that formerly enslaved of the Greenville Women's College who stayed with the college and continued to work with it until his death. But again, helped show the myth of the big black brute myth is what we call it in rhetoric. But the idea that Black men were inherently dangerous or sexualized, but in fact were the only trusted people to serve the women's college and to be amongst that, otherwise disparate group of white women who were living there. So those are the three of the big figures that I mentioned in that history that I probably needed to explain better. So thanks for the prompt.
Are they more questions? If they send them to you, I won't see them.
Yeah, I don't have any on mine on my chat. I'm done.
Okay, so I was sort of curious with the naming, and you went into part of that. I don't know who originated it, but being a writer myself, I really was. I think seeking Abraham was really an interesting choice of words. You could have. It was simple, and yet to me it was meaningful for a lot of reasons, because there's a lot of play. Obviously, Abraham was the father of the Jewish existence, right? And it's in the Old Testament for sure. Equally interesting to me was, well, guess what? Abraham happens to be the first name of the emancipator of the African Americans, Abraham Lincoln. So that made it more meaningful. And the choice of the word seeking is really a neat word, Mr. Communication, where it really means something. It has a strong connotation of a strong desire for discovery and discovering information that you don't know, and you're really going to undertake it with a high desire and a high level of commitment. So try to discover something you don't already understand or know. So whoever chose the title, I think, deserves probably more credit than they've ever been given.
That would mostly. So I challenged the group in those exact directions you just pointed, but I will say the credit goes to Claire Whitlinger in our sociology department. She was the one that helped craft that name. So I was talking about repair and reckoning and so forth, and she said, but the issue is we've got to. And she to Dennis, all your beautiful points there, exactly what you just said. You think about the fact that Abraham is this figure not only within Christianity but also Judaism and Islam, right? Abraham is the father figure for all of those religions. It already has that notion of this pull, this magnetism to it. Everyone wants to be part of that Abrahamic tradition. And so I hope that's also what's happening with our Abraham, with Furman's historical Abraham Sims, that we're all in some ways trying to both seek him out as something out there, but also then let him become us, that we would empathize and understand the world from his position, that we could embody Abraham's worldview, which is to say, I want to help Furman, but I also realize all the crap that the institution can do, because you are part of a larger system in which slavery is controlling you and controlling your body and what you can do and so forth. So I think it can be a very spiritual journey in terms of seeing things from a different perspective and transcending your own perspective.
Back to Asha then, on your minor of cultures, in this case, Africans didn't choose, they didn't elect to come to South Carolina or to the United States. They didn't have a choice. So that's forced movement. And I think your interest is what happens to that culture when it leaves, in particular, when it leaves Africa, it comes to South Carolina. What is important about that culture, and what are the aspects of it? Obviously, there's music that comes. There's some type of religion in one way or another that comes. So how do you figure this out? What does this mean? Where are you in that journey of discovering, what happened to those cultures? Should those cultures exist? Should they be permitted? Should they be encouraged? What's your approach?
So that's a big question. And I think my first answer is absolutely any bit of our diasporic culture should be preserved and memorialized. And also, I am interested in what the progression has been, how we have changed. But I think what I am most interested in is how those cultures have been affected by white people, by white supremacy, by oppression. How have we changed because of the effect of other cultures on us? Because I think the case is clear that everybody wants our culture. Everybody loves Black people until they love Black culture, but they don't love Black people, is what I'm trying to say. And so I plan to get my PhD someday soon. And I hope to study at some point or another the effects of white supremacy symbolism on Black and brown livelihood and what that does to our communities, what that does to our culture and our people. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Well, yeah, it does. Of course, it's a broader question as well, because all cultures are impacted by a move someplace else. Even the Pilgrims coming over, or the Irish coming. We have a huge Irish settlement that occurred in North Carolina, and that's where their music, in particular, they kept that music, and now that music has moved into more mainstream or whatever. So what you basically have, however, is two or three or four, or a mix of cultures mixing, and hopefully you have a blending that lasts. But some change is natural, as you're pointing out, and some change is enforced or is forced. So I was asking what angle you were looking at it, because there's a forced migration and there's an unforced one, and that's a little bit different. But still, when you get there, when you get to wherever you're talking about, you're always impacted by who's there first, unless you're American Indian. That didn't go so well, but you get impacted either way, and it really goes both ways. But you're right, depending if you're at a huge disadvantage, as the slaves were, it doesn't necessarily go. There's a story, whether it's true or not, I don't know. We used to live in a community in the mountains that actually was a fairly wealthy family that had farmland, and so yes, they had slaves. And what was taken over, the land was sold and so on, taken over. It's where the little rivers come together. It's all very rich land for farming and stuff. And so they had some slaves, probably never more than 8 or 9, but anyway, slaves they were. Anyway, the cemetery had fallen into disrepair, and so I was hiking one day and discovered it, and so I got a group of guys together, and we were going to fix it up. Well, we discovered that there were a couple granite headstones of the white plantation owners, and then we found these little rock stones, little tiny ones, and some were pushed down and over the 100 years or whatever it was. So we put them up, and we fixed the other grave robbers had gone after the plantation one, so we fixed that up as well. And then I was talking to somebody, and they said, "Hey, Dennis, do you know the story about the placement of the graves of the plantation owners?" And I said, "Well, no." I said, he said they're oriented. They're oriented so that the white plantation owners were buried with their heads, so they would see the sunrise come up. And he said, we've done studies of looking at down in other cemeteries, and the headstones for the slaves will be the other way. And I said, well, why is that? And the fable or story, it was that the slaves wanted to face west, the setting sun, because then their work was done and they could be with their families. So whether that's true or not, I have no clue, but that's sort of interesting. And that's part of the cultural thing that I would tag into your study if it's true. No clue?
Well, I'll add in, that when we're looking at Brutontown Cemetery right here in Greenville, you've got that same great history going on in terms of the fact that we haven't actually, so we got really close to finding Abraham Sims' grave because we found his brother's grave. And all I can imagine is that Abraham didn't have a headstone. So we've got plenty of rocks in the cemetery for people who were too poor to afford a headstone. And again, think of the taking of wealth in even that moment, right? The fact that someone who worked for the university community for all those years wasn't wealthy enough to afford a headstone for his grave, and yet his brother, by whatever means, was able to. So, it just shows you the kinds of systemic theft on the part of white people from Black culture that, even some basic things that we assume all people with human dignity should have, like some marker as to their gravesite. Especially in that era, we didn't have cremation and all these options. It was just a Christian burial, right? But it was under the white auspices in a white tradition, and that depending on the treatment of the formerly enslaved persons, that they could be still under just a lowly rock rather than a granite headstone. So you see that, and to Asha's studies, you find questions about surviving African traditions in places like the fragmentary evidence of a cemetery. And so you can we found the crescent moon in some of our South Carolina cemeteries. And so the symbol there of Islam in African burial sites in South Carolina. So, and of course, our moon and our flag, people argue it's the gaudulate that goes around the neck, but it also has that enslaved tradition of being part of the Abrahamic and Islamic faith. So it's, Dennis, to your points, I mean, it's super, super complex. Historians have to be allies in this work because it's fragmentary, because it was so damaged by white supremacy. It takes a lot of work just to get back to the level you're talking about, the Irish, for example, just to get to the level of Irish ancestry knowledge, traditions, and so forth. It takes a huge amount of historical work to reconstruct those traditions out of what we're left with.
Okay, guys, it's coming on to 1:30. Other classes need to start. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and your activity. And I'm really happy to see that something tangible is happening, has happened. It's not just getting filed away and saying, "Oh, that was a nice thing." Things are actually changing, and the so what is really important when you do an activity like this. Ask yourself, "So what?" And I myself am very pleased as to what I see. Next week, we're going to have a lecture on gardening for birds. Bird watching has increased 500% or so during the virus. Everybody's stuck at home, they're watching birds. And so the lecture is going to be about how do you garden to get birds. So join us next week. And then to learn, don't forget to brag to your friends about the Ollie at Furman YouTube site, so you can watch this presentation or others you haven't seen ever again. Thanks much. Bye.